Chapter 6 Voltaire, Candide, or Optimism. Aims. This chapter will undertake a close literary analysis of Voltaire's prose work Candide. Examine the function of both real and metaphorical travels in Candide. Explore the relationship between Candide and its literary and philosophical contexts. Introduction. Two Parisian buildings encapsulate the life history and reputation of François-Marie Arouet, 1694-1778, known to literature as Voltaire. The first building on the right bank of the river Seine is the Bastille prison, the stoutest and most fearful jail maintained by what we now call the Ancien Regime in France. Demolished by a mob of rioters on the eve of the French Revolution in 1789, it had for centuries epitomized the social repression and power of a royalist church and state. The second building on the left bank of the Seine is the Pantheon, converted at the Revolution from a church to a secular temple to house the remains of France's most revered authors. Voltaire is notable for being an occupant of both buildings. He was briefly imprisoned in the first for his outspokenness in 1717 to 1718. And his body was finally transferred to the second with great pomp and ceremony in 1791. Voltaire's progress from the one building to the other, and the resulting dramatic change in his national status, tells us much about him and about France. In this chapter, we will consider Voltaire's best-known text, Candide, or Optimism, 1759. Voltaire was a remarkably prolific writer, and Candide appeared late in his career. He sometimes spoke of his rage d'essayer, his mania for writing, and the legend exists to the effect that he dashed off Candide in 3 short days. But Candide was in fact a work of quite long gestation, lasting at least a year, during which its author responded to public events by tinkering extensively with his wording and structure. In this chapter, we will study the physical and philosophical journeys of the main characters in Candide and the contexts of Voltaire's own life and intellectual world. We have referred throughout to the Penguin Classics 2005 edition, translated and edited by Theo Cuff. You may want to read the entire text now, before starting work in this chapter. Voltaire, his world, and his book. Before we turn to the next of Candide, it is important to think about its place in Voltaire's life and career. Activity 1. Read through the chronology of Voltaire's life at the beginning of your edition of Candide. Note down the most significant events in Voltaire's life, paying particular attention to those that made him so controversial in his day. Read through and note on the text in your edition of Candide, and summarize Candide's publication history and its initial impact. Discussion. I noted the following points. 1. Voltaire was born into an affluent family in 1694 and educated by the Jesuits at the Collège Louis le Grand. Voltaire became a reluctant law student to please his notary father, and was briefly a diplomat. But from 1715 he occupied himself exclusively with his writing, earning his first brief spell of imprisonment in 1717 to 1718 for writing a satire against the regent. After his release, he was sufficiently in favor to have 3 of his plays performed at King Louis XV's wedding in 1725. But by 1726 he was in trouble again and had to flee to England. In England, he met King George I and many members of the literary and scientific elite. For much of the 1730s, Voltaire was in official disfavor and living in exile. But by the 1740s, his fortunes recovered and he became a major figure on the European stage. Friend to Frederick of Prussia, protege of Madame de Pompadour, a mistress of Louis XV. Royal historiographer and member of the Académie Française. By 1754, however, his star had plummeted again. He quarreled with Frederick, was refused entry back into France, and was forced to wander around Central Europe in a condition of virtual statelessness. He settled in Switzerland, and in 1756 published the first edition of his essay on general history and on the manners and spirit of the nations. He continued to participate in political intrigues. In 1757, he was involved in secret peace negotiations between Frederick of Prussia and Louis XV. In early 1759, Candide was published, and the French Parliament impounded the loose sheets. Even sympathetic Geneva briefly banned the book. Voltaire stayed in the relative safety of Switzerland for most of the rest of his life, producing literary works well into his 80s, notably his Philosophical Dictionary, 1764. Never afraid of contention, he risked notoriety yet again in 1762-1763 by challenging the French government over its treatment of Jean Calas, a French Protestant merchant falsely accused of murdering his son for wanting to convert to Catholicism. He had one last triumph, when in 1778 he returned to Paris for the first time in 20 years to see his last play, the tragedy Iron, performed. While he was there, he fell ill and died with the words, "For God's sake, leave me in peace." The words were somewhat typical of him, at the same time irreverent and strangely reverent, impatient yet longing for tranquility. 2. Candide first appeared in late January 1759 when it was issued in 3 simultaneous editions of 1,000 copies each in Paris, Geneva, and Amsterdam. This strategy was motivated by the desire to sell as many copies as possible before it was pirated and by the fear of censorship. Both of these considerations were justified. Over 20 further editions, including translations, were published in 1759 alone, and in February 1759, authorities in Paris and Geneva seized copies of Candide in an attempt to suppress it. The title page bore the inscription from the German of Dr. Ralph, and Voltaire's name did not in fact appear. The authorship of the book, however, was an open secret. Voltaire only publicly admitted to being an author in 1768. A new edition was published in 1761, incorporating some rewriting and new passages, and it is this edition that we study in this chapter. Voltaire was a writer of great comic gifts, with a vivid sense of pace. He would have wanted you to relish his wicked story, because he believed that literature should be entertaining, and also because his almost farcical effects are often part of his message. Indeed, it was for these reasons that in 1956 an acclaimed musical version of Candide was produced on Broadway, with lyrics by Lillian Hellman, Stephen Sondheim, and others, and a score by Leonard Bernstein. Activity 2. If you have not already done so, you should read Candide now. Read it through in one go, not pausing unduly over details or references you do not recognize. Most will become clear as we go along. What are the different ways in which the idea of journeying operates throughout the text? Discussion. Several kinds of traveling are implicated, either directly or indirectly, in this versatile book. Among them are the personal itineraries of Candide and Kondagand, and in your edition of Candide as well, as the digressions from the main track taken by minor figures such as Candide's servant Cacambo. Another less literal kind of journey is the intellectual journey that follows the succession of challenges to Pangloss's ideal of optimism. The routes and destinations of all of these interconnected travels constitute an absorbing mix of ideas and debate, and I shall deal with each of the different journeys the text recounts. First, though, I will consider the literary and philosophical precursors available for Voltaire to emulate and or satirize. Literary and philosophical antecedents. The group of wanderers in Candide is spurred on by more than idle curiosity. Partly, they seem to be driven by some sort of philosophical quest. If this is travel writing, then it is travel writing in a particular tradition. To contextualize this, it is helpful to look at different ways in which travel writing has been used. Superficially, travel writing may seem to constitute a genre that is primarily descriptive and narrative. It tells the story, real or imagined, of a person or a group of persons voyaging from place to place. In practice, as you saw in the previous chapter on Oronoco, no such writing is ever neutral, since travelers inevitably compare the worlds they are traveling through to their own world. Sometimes this can lead travelers to make negative and even racist judgments, At other times, it can lead them to recognize flaws in their own society, and on yet other occasions, it can lead them to reflect upon the universality of the human condition. A marked philosophical strand thus runs through much early travel writing. 5th century BCE, Greek historian Herodotus, for example, was much interested in the religion and morals of the countries through which he passed. And Pausanias' 2nd century CE account of his travels through Greece dwells on the belief systems and cults of every community he visits. In the early modern period, it was a comparatively straightforward development for writers schooled in such ancient travel accounts to turn the focus back to front. Instead of deriving insights into customs and beliefs from observations of different peoples and places, they started out with propositions concerning the social nature of human mankind that they then tested by applying them to various real, or in many cases imagined worlds. Utopian literature, which appeared for the first time in 1516 with the publication of Utopia, from the Greek eutopos, good place, or alternatively autopos, no place, by the English scholar Thomas More, 1478-1535, projected imaginary environments based upon political principles or ideals. In the case of More, religious toleration, the equal education of the sexes, and the absence of money and private property. A contrary tendency later arose, whereby authors fantasized about worlds in which human ideals of a perfect society were shown to be ridiculous, or at least impracticable. In Gulliver's Travels, 1726, by the Irish writer and cleric Jonathan Swift, 1667-1745, a ship's surgeon, Lemuel Gulliver, is cast away on a succession of imaginary islands, in each of which facets of human stupidity or greed are exaggerated, or in the case of Lilliput, scaled down, so that the disparity between observed conduct and the panaceas framed by philosophers or statesmen become blandly apparent. A book such as Gulliver's Travels thus constituted an anti-utopian or dystopian exercise that gave the lie to particular myths of human perfectibility. Voltaire knew Swift's work well and had lived in England, the relative freedom of whose institutions, relative that is, to the absolutist monarchy of the France of his own day, attracted him. To some extent, Voltaire is writing in a Swiftian satiric vein. There is, of course, one major difference. Swift, like his near contemporary Daniel Defoe in Robinson Crusoe, 1719, drew on real-life accounts left by actual travelers, but the islands he describes do not correspond to any recognizable location. Voltaire, on the other hand, was very interested in evoking the feel of the world as it is hard, inescapable reality. He thus situates the environments featured in Candide fairly specifically on the map. However, lurid his characterization of cities or countries, his Westphalia is based on the real country, his Lisbon is the real capital of a real country, his Paris and his Constantinople likewise. He thus draws on the existing or surviving memoirs of travelers far more directly than do either Defoe or Swift. When writing about South America, for example, he is conscious of and mentions the explorations of Guyana by Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554-1618. Raleigh's book, The Discovery of Guyana, 1591, was itself a major source for the idea of El Dorado, which I will discuss later. When his narrative moves to Turkey, he is possibly aware of the still unpublished, though unofficially circulating, letters from Constantinople written by Lady Wortley Montague, 1689-1762. An ambassador's wife and one of the few Westerners ever to have been allowed inside a seraglio or harem. There was a community of insight between France and England that manifests itself in Candide, a contemporaneous work published in the same month as Candide, that is, in January 1759, was an English text close to it in structure and theme, the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, or Rasselas for short, by the writer and lexicographer Samuel Johnson, 1709-1784. Johnson dashed off his small masterpiece in order to defray his mother's burial expenses, without himself attending the funeral. In it, a pampered young aristocrat from a fairly inexactly described happy valley in the vicinity of Ethiopia is cast out to make his way in the great world beyond in the company of his sister and the philosopher Imlac. He finds there nothing but misery and heartache. Though Johnson regarded Voltaire as a notorious radical, sceptic, and rake, resemblances of shape and viewpoint are apparent in these two peripatetic and philosophically inclined narratives. The genre of Candide. But what genre do these works belong to? The long 18th century was the first great period in the evolution of the novel, a genre of which Bain's Ornaco might be seen as an early example. In France, the form was known as the roman because of its roots in medieval romance. In England, it was known as the novel because it was, well, a novel. According to strict definitions of the 18th century novel, Candide does not entirely meet the generic requirements for the novel, or indeed for the novella, novel in miniature. In shape and thrust, it is far closer to a fable or parable, since its meanings lie comparatively close to the surface, and little happens within it that is not designed to make a point in the ongoing argument. Voltaire had tried his hand at this sort of thing before, for example in his Eastern tale Zadig in 1747. The term used by the French to classify this kind of exercise was a philosophical tale. The same description goes for Johnson's Rasselas. Another literary category often associated with Candide is that of satire, which is writing that ridicules or mocks the failings of individuals, institutions, or societies. As Voltaire allows his readers to draw their own conclusions, Candide should probably be classified as indirect satire. But this in no way diminishes the intensity of the ridicule and scorn Voltaire directs at the hypocrisies and iniquities of his day. Indeed, together with his contemporaries Swift, Johnson, and the poet Alexander Pope, 1688-1744, Voltaire contributes in no small way to the long 18th century's reputation as Europe's greatest period of satire. Activity 3. The original title page, in a variety of fonts, reads Candide or Optimism, translated from the German of Dr. Ralph, with the additions found in the doctor's pocket when he died at Minden, in the year of grace in 1759. What expectations do the words on the title page generate? Now reread the opening paragraph of Chapter 1 of Candide and consider how these expectations are sustained, or disrupted. Discussion. The words on the title page give the impression that Candide or Optimism is a translation from German of a story by one Dr. Ralph. The inventions of an original German text and a Dr. Ralph lend a quasi-objectivity to the text, and distance the narrator from Voltaire himself. However, if Voltaire's readers were attuned to the literary conventions of the day, they would have recognized the idea of a German original and the existence of a Dr. Ralph as inventions as part of the fiction. English readers would of course be reading a book purportedly translated from German to French that had in fact been translated from French to English. This playful element subverts the superficially earnest account of the young man Candide's personal history in the opening paragraph. The very first words themselves, once upon a time, suggest the beginning of a fairy tale, and the combination of absurd names and the ironic tone establish immediately a distinctive narrative voice. For example, the gossip of the older servants is the source for the belief that Candide was the legitimate son of the Baron's sister, and a kindly and honest gentleman of the neighborhood. That the narrator describes Candide's preassumed father so indulgently, and not as an adulterer or fornicator, suggests unworldly and naive qualities, qualities we soon discover also to be characteristic of Candide himself. From the outset, the reader is thus given very clear hints not to take at face value the narrator's version of events and his judgments of individuals, peoples, and places. Like Ben before him, Voltaire therefore makes extensive use of literary irony, the use of a naive or deluded hero or unreliable narrator whose view of the world differs widely from the true circumstances recognized by the author or readers. Literary irony thus flatters its reader's intelligence at the expense of a character or fictional narrator. The account of Candide's travels and adventures by Voltaire's unreliable fictional narrator, Dr. Ralph, does indeed differ widely from the true circumstances recognized by the author or readers, and much of the humor in Candide is derived from the ironic distance between the narrator's words and Voltaire's satirical attack on his society. Pangloss's Journey, From Theory to Fact. Voltaire's philosophical views, expressed in literary works like Candide and philosophical works like his Philosophical Dictionary, were defined in opposition to the belief in optimism, which dominated the philosophy of his day. For some extracts from Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary, see Appendix 3 at the back of your edition of Candide. In particular, the entries bien, all is good, and chain of events. Candide is overtly named after his adventurous, if naive, hero, but it is its subtitle, optimism, that announces its theme. The character of Candide's tutor, Pangloss, is the inexhaustible spokesman on behalf of optimism, and all of the main characters in the course of their journeys test the very limits of Pangloss's creed. The character of Pangloss was Voltaire's exaggerated comic creation, but optimism in the condition of the world, and human prospects within it, could be found pretty well everywhere in the Europe of the mid-18th century. For obvious reasons, it was more common among the rich than among the poor, men than women, the healthy rather than the sick, slave owners rather than slaves. Optimism had distinct intellectual sources. In his Philosophical Dictionary, Voltaire finds its origins in characteristics of men, manners, opinions, times, 1711, by Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, 1671-1713, who had speculated that benevolence was an instinct deeply embedded in human nature and quite consistent with self-interest. Since we all wished for one another's well-being, all that we needed to do was to follow our own inclinations in everything, and everybody would be fine. The highest profile attained by the creed of optimism was its articulation by one of the greatest poets of his age, Alexander Pope. His essay on man is the supremely confident expression of this attitude, trumpeted forth as if from the console of some great organ. On the continent, the principal exponents of philosophical optimism resided in Germany, where their thought was more systematic and thorough, since it was connected with more technical philosophical fields, such as metaphysics, the study of the first principles of things, and epistemology, the study of the acquisition of knowledge. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646-1716, for example, had argued the case from the nature of God, since the Creator was both omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipotent, all-powerful, and since he wished that his creatures should be happy, it followed of necessity that the world he had made was one that secured the most contentedness he could contrive. Leibniz did not deny that nasty things happened, or that people suffered. Such a position would be ridiculous. But human beings were not omniscient, they had limited knowledge, and what appeared to them to be blemishes or setbacks could very well be part of the grand universal plan. Only God, with his serene overview, saw how. This theory was not as balmy or anachronistic as it now may seem to some. In fact, it is one of the most frequently cited answers to two dilemmas theologians, called the problem of evil and the problem of pain. Both pain and evil seem contradictory in a world supposedly overseen by a compassionate governor. In Candide, Voltaire repeatedly points this out. We should not, however, fall into the trap of regarding Voltaire as necessarily right, and Leibniz and his followers as necessarily wrong. The truth is that they are tackling the same issue from opposite ends of a spectrum. Leibniz was a rationalist philosopher. His approach might be characterized as arguing forward from certain assumptions. Since God is perfect by definition, it follows that he can do no wrong. Voltaire's approach might be described as empirical. He used his experience of the world around him to draw certain conclusions about it. These two approaches are sometimes referred to as a priori and a posteriori reasoning. Then, in 1755, something occurred that rocked the sanguine belief in optimism entirely. On the 1st of November, at approximately 9:40 in the morning, a fissure some 5 meters wide opened up under the Atlantic Ocean, off the shoreline of the Portuguese capital Lisbon, extending right across the main area of the city. Buildings tottered and fell. It was All Saints' Day, and the churches were full of people attending Mass as the walls collapsed. They were crushed in their thousands. How could a benevolent and all-seeing deity possibly have ordained this? Outside, people had been cooking their breakfasts on open fires in a cool autumn air. The quake overturned the fires which raged uncontrollably across town. A few minutes later, a violent tsunami swept in from the sea, drowning many of those who had not been crushed. Estimates of the dead varied widely. The figure suggested has been as high as 100,000, though in the relevant episode in Candide, Voltaire mentions a total a little less than a third of that number. Much of the infrastructure of the city was also destroyed. Most of its buildings had been pulverized. If you visit Lisbon today, you will find the only medieval buildings that survive are high up in the hills, where the quake did not reach. A further impact was on the philosophical calm that had reigned in European intellectual circles for close on half a century. Voltaire himself became rapidly convinced that a tragedy on this scale spelled the death knell of the complacent certainties put about by disciples of Leibniz. The shock of the Lisbon earthquake was compounded by the 7 Years' War, which was triggered when Frederick of Prussia, Voltaire's one-time mentor, invaded Saxony. The war subsequently spread, first across the rest of Europe and then to North America and South Asia, where France and Britain were soon at loggerheads over their colonial possessions. Among Voltaire's well-born friends at the time was the Duchess of Saxe-Gotha, who went to the front line to observe the fighting. In one of the earliest battles, her son was killed. Voltaire reported in a letter that she carried on, crying, "Whatever is right," in her lamentable voice. Activity 4. Read the concluding stanza of the first epistle from Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man, 1733-1734. Reproduced below, and then summarize his argument in your own words. Seize then, nor order, imperfection name. Our proper bliss depends on what we blame. Know thy own point, this kind, this due degree of blindness, weakness, heaven bestows on thee. Submit in this or any other sphere, secure to be as blessed as thou canst bear, safe in the hand of one disposing power, or in the natal or the mortal hour. All nature is but art, unknown to thee, all chance direction, which thou canst not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil universal good. And spite of pride, in erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. Reread Chapter 5 of Candide, and contrast Voltaire's views on optimism with those of Pope, and Leibniz is summarized above. Discussion 1. For the first half of the 18th century, this stanza from Pope was something of a mantra for paid-up, fully believing optimists, regularly rolled out in articles, tracts, and public speeches. Voltaire himself quoted Pope's axiom, "Whatever is right," ironically in the subtitle of his 1756 poem. The Lisbon earthquake, see the translation of the poem by Tobias Smollett, 1721-1771, in Appendix 2 of your edition of Candide. Pope, in this stanza, repeats the optimistic truism of his age that all evils afflicting individuals must be understood, and accepted as ultimately part of a divine plan. For the suffering individual, the appropriate response is to submit, in this or in any other sphere, since he or she is safe in the hand of one disposing power, God. 4 lines of antithesis beginning with the word all then dramatize the apparent contradiction between present and immediate ills, and God's beneficence, culminating in the line all partial evil, universal good. For Pope, the universal good is consolation that contains and transcends the particularities of partial evil. The argument is clinched in the final line, which insists upon the one truth that is clear, namely that whatever unfolds in life, however unpleasant, what is part of a benevolent divine plan, is right. 2. Chapter 5 of Candide, like Voltaire's entries in his philosophical dictionary, attacks the cosmic complacency, the thin optimism expressed in Pope's lines. The weapon used is ridicule, a technique at which Voltaire is particularly adept. Leibniz's ideas are expressed by Candide's tutor Pangloss, and are repeatedly shown up as preposterous. When the virtue's Anabaptist is drowning, Pangloss restrains Candide from rescuing him, arguing that Lisbon harbor was built expressly so that this Anabaptist should one day drown in it, and offering a priori proofs of this. Pangloss berates the sailor for looting the ruins of the city with the unctuous words, "You are flouting the laws of universal reason, and this is hardly the time or the place," but is roundly rebuffed by the sailor, who parades his villainy unapologetically. "4 times I've trampled on the cross. You've picked the wrong man, with your drivel about universal reason." A third example of how Voltaire exposes the limitation of Pangloss's philosophy of optimism, and by extension Pope's and Leibniz's, is during the dinner after the earthquake, when he declares, in words echoing Pope's An Essay on Man, "This is all for the best. For if there is a volcano beneath Lisbon, then it cannot be anywhere else. For it is impossible for things to be elsewhere rather than where they are. For all is well." In the context of the devastation caused by the earthquake, Pangloss's parroting of Pope's and Leibniz's creed of optimism comes across as especially platitudinous and inadequate. Was it possible for adherents of Pope or Leibniz to square the contradiction between the dispiriting events of the Lisbon earthquake and the 7 Years' War, and the view that everything in the world was perfectly conceived? They provided several stock responses to this challenge. The first was an insistence on the Leibnizian philosophical axiom that, in the ultimate scheme of things, there exists a sufficient reason for each and every event, fully able to account for even its unfortunate seeming aspects. The second was the scientific view that all happenings are part of an inexorable web of cause and effect, which nothing can influence or even divert. The third was a religious doctrine, advanced by the agent for the Roman Catholic Inquisition, that people are responsible for much that is wrong in the world because their nature has been corrupted since the time of Adam and Eve by so-called original sin. People can choose to act as they wish, but their will, though technically free, will inevitably cause them to act badly. It is clear from the mocking portrayal of Pangloss and Candide that Voltaire found none of these 3 responses remotely convincing. Voltaire's attack on the ideas of Leibniz and Pope is not limited to matters of content. His very style of writing is an assault upon what he saw as their self-deluding optimism. Much has been written about Voltaire's style. Its alacrity, its bounce, the speed of its transitions, and these qualities so appropriate for describing travel are put to good use in Candide. The title of Candide is principally taken from the name of its protagonist, but it applies quickly well to its style. This is a book that pulls no punches, makes no effort to be civil, even rejoices in its earthy rudeness. It says it is how it is. Voltaire's candor is therefore integral to his message. His target is not just the illusions fed by a particular school of philosophy, but the sort of moral dishonesty present in most ages that flinches away from the facts and pretties them up with mealy-mouthed, sociably acceptable persiflage. In 18th century English, there was a term for such well-meaning linguistic avoidance. It was called cant, a word that had its origin in the Italian verb for to sing, but which had come to mean the whining of a beggar, or by extension, all manner of humbug or sanctimonious waffling. For Voltaire, it was the enemy because it led people to deceive others, and often also to deceive themselves. His view was that to write or speak simply and directly is usually to write or speak as well. Kondagand's Journey, Candor, Not Can. The unworldly Dr. Ralph is not the only narrator in Candide, There are 3 episodes in the novel recounted by women. Chapter 8 is narrated by Candide's beloved, Kondagand, who retells the events of the opening chapters from her perspective. Chapters 11 and 12 are narrated by the old woman, who tells Kondagand the story of her calamitous life, and the first part of chapter 24 is narrated by Paquette, who disabuses Candide of his perception that she is happy by describing her decline from serving maid to prostitute. In these episodes, told from a feminine perspective, Voltaire gives us history from the point of view of its victims, whereas Dr. Ralph describes Pangloss's philosophy of optimism uncritically, and as readers alive to literary irony, we register that Voltaire is satirizing the creed of Pope and Leibniz. In these 3 episodes, narrated by female characters, Pangloss's sanguine apathy is exposed as an overwhelmingly masculine delusion by the blunt facts of female subservience in a male-dominant society. In the introduction to your edition of Candide, Michael Wood describes Paquette's story as another worst of all possible world story. And indeed, all 3 women tell tales of spectacular suffering and misadventure, which are nonetheless lightened, although this might be a matter of taste, by their transparent absurdities and extravagant hyperbole. The most important of the female characters in Candide is Kondagand. In terms of the plot, much of Candide's journeying is in search of Kondagand, but her name warns us that she is no princess in a fairy tale rescued by a brave prince, and nor is she a sentimental heroine in a conventional 18th century novel. Kondagand's name simultaneously derives from the chaste wife of Henry II, Saint Kondagand, and compounds explicit sexual references, which are exploited throughout the novel for a variety of comic effects. Aside from its comic effects, her name also discloses Voltaire's concern in Candide to promote the quality of candor. Voltaire's reliance on associations conjured up by her name is in keeping with her own frankness about the body. Several other implications seem to be present, that what we commonly regard as beautiful may also be quite obscene, or that what we commonly regard as obscene may in fact be quite beautiful. The third suggestion is that, during the course of her tribulations, Kondagand has sometimes been reduced to a sexual plaything. Activity 5. Reread Chapter 8, Kondagand's story, and think about the style, tone, and the way in which the tumultuous events are narrated. How much difference does it make that the narrator of this story is a woman? Discussion. Chapter 8 constitutes a flashback. In other words, it retells the events of chapters 2 to 7 from a different perspective, that of Kondagand. As such, it inserts into the tale of a feminine point of view at variance with, or at least complementary to, Dr. Ralph's main narrative. Kondagand is recounting her story in Lisbon, which gives Voltaire a chance to portray the injustices meted out in this traditionalist Catholic society on 4 minorities: women, Protestants, intellectuals, and Jews. Like the rest of the book, however, her narrative involves journeys beginning in Westphalia, where the assault on the Baron's castle is retold from the point of view of one of its female victims. Notice how much less blushing and embarrassed Kondagand is than Candide. After she is rescued from being raped by the Bulgar soldier, for example, she concedes that she is physically attracted to her rescuer. Kondagand recounts all of this with supreme honesty, and in this she expresses herself very much in the same spirit as Voltaire himself, who throughout the text utilizes what the translator of your edition, Theo Cuff, calls a new language of plain speaking. Kondagand's candor is also directed at Voltaire's philosophical targets, and in direct contrast to Dr. Ralph. Kondagand concludes from her awful experiences that Pangloss is utterly wrong. Pangloss deceived me cruelly after all, when he told me that all is for the best in this world. The contrast between Dr. Ralph's and Kondagand's narrations can be further appreciated if we pause to examine more closely the translation of Kondagand's story from the French. Kondagand's straightforwardness is quite beyond the naive Candide. When he hears about a blow to her thigh delivered by her assailant, he tells her with a sort of flustered self-consciousness that one day he would very much like to inspect this wound, or rather the mark of the wound. The French original is instructive, since both blow and thigh are masculine nouns, whereas mark is feminine. The gendered syntax makes it clear it is something feminine and intimate that Candide confusedly wishes to see. The next example is when Kondagand declares that the Bulgar captain lost all his money and his taste for me. Theocuff's translation is a little coy, since Voltaire's own wording says bluntly that he had grown disgusted with her. The fickleness and also the potential cruelty of physical desire are the point here. He then sells her to a Jew named Don Issachar, whose primary characteristic is seen as being his race. Again, Voltaire's directness wins through. Anti-Semitism in the Europe of his day was a fact of life, and he does not beat about the bush in conjuring it up. In fact, he exploits it to bring out a double iniquity, when the local Grand Inquisitor finds out that a Jew is Kondagand's keeper. He reprimands her by pointing out how far beneath my rank it was to be the chattel of an Israelite. The French word here is rang, which means both someone's rank or social class and a rung on a ladder. Voltaire is indicating an older idea, the ladder of a great chain of being which, in the Renaissance period, was thought to support all human hierarchies. The ladder reached down from God to the lowliest pebble, but women and Jews were both allotted very low rungs at the human level. The Inquisitor is hinting to Kondagand that if she consorts with him, she will move up a rung or two. Voltaire then mockingly endorses this view by making Kondagand, who is temporarily at the mercy of both gentlemen, refer to the Inquisitor as His Eminence. Though the French text actually gives his exact title as Monsignor, both of these accolades are reserved for the most senior clerks in the Roman Catholic Church, such as cardinals. The Inquisitor is probably entitled to neither of them. Kondagand is now caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. But with frank realism, she realizes that her allure depends upon her unavailability. The Bulgar captain, who once enjoyed her favors, soon came to despise her. She is not going to make the same mistake with either the Jewish merchant or the priestly dignitary, so she keeps both of them dangling. Activity 6. In order to appreciate the range of Voltaire's tone, read through the following passages again. Make some notes about how the tone differs in the two passages before reading the discussion. 1. The old woman's description of herself as a girl suffering terrible ordeals in Morocco, and then coming to consciousness with an Italian lying on top of her. 2. Candide's encounter with the Dutch slave in Suriname. Discussion. 1. In the old woman's story, the man lying on top of her had been an Italian castrato, a male singer castrated at puberty to preserve the quality of his treble voice into adulthood. In the 18th century, such professional singers were much prized in the opera houses of Naples. They earned considerable sums and were very popular with women. However, in this passage, Voltaire is not interested in expressing any sympathy for the castrato, or any such complexities. He is only concerned to exploit the comic potential of the scene, and to enjoy the ridiculousness of the poor man's predicament. He therefore has him complaining over and over again, "Ah, what a fate to be without balls!" Frankness and farce could not go much farther. Voltaire's prevailing tone here is comic, even at times consciously farcical. 2. Voltaire's tone in the second passage is rather different. The slave recounts his sufferings, from his mother selling him on the coast of Guinea, to his Dutch master in Suriname, cutting off his right hand and left leg. The slave's African mother and his Dutch owner both benefited by his enslavement. But the slave declares himself to be 1,000 times more miserable than dogs, monkeys, and parrots. The impact of the encounter with the slave upon Candide is profound, as he cries, "Oh, Pangloss, this is one abomination you could not have anticipated, and I fear it has finally done it for me. I am giving up on your optimism after all." It is worth recalling that Voltaire introduced this interlude at a late stage in the composition of the book, specifically to make this feeling about the slave trade clear. Voltaire's tone here is far more comic. Instead, his satire assumes a serious edge in order to express unequivocally how much he abominates slavery. In order for such a counterblast to the apathy of optimism to work, it must be narrated candidly, with no avoidance of unpleasant facts. The female narrators, as well as the Dutch slave in Suriname, are not in the slightest bit delicate when it comes to telling people about the cruelties, perversities, and humiliations that have been their lot. They tell their histories throughout with unflinching honesty and candor. Cacambo's journey, the best of impossible worlds. Cacambo accompanies Candide upon most of his journeys, but the section I want to focus upon in particular is their sojourn in El Dorado, where Cacambo translates all the exchanges with El Dorado's inhabitants for Candide. The word El Dorado literally means the man of gold. By the 16th century, however, it had come to refer to something else, a legendary country in the far hinterland of South America, where gold was as common as any other rock, and where, as a consequence, it could be carried off with impunity to reward and enrich its despoilers. Of course, we now know this place has been utterly mythical, and its secrets to have been diluted. But it is not difficult to see how this opulent fairyland had welled up from the Western imagination. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many galleons laden with gold artifacts had made their way eastwards across the Atlantic towards Spain or Portugal. The main participants in this lucrative quest, leading people to suppose there was an ultimate source for all of this booty. And so men hacked their way through forests and up mountain ranges, laying waste to several complex civilizations in the process. The Inca culture in Peru, the Aztec culture in Mexico, in order to find it. And in the 18th century, the myth was not quite dead. Activity 7. Reread Chapter 18, What They Saw in the Land of El Dorado, paying particular attention to the interview with the 172-year-old citizen of El Dorado, the reception at court, and Candide and Cacambo's decision to leave the country and return to Europe. Two related contradictions seem to be present throughout this passage. First, why in a work dedication to the proposition that perfection is impossible should Voltaire have inserted an episode set in an environment that seemingly satisfies the most luxurious dreams of most people? Second, why, having established this haven of affluence, should he cause his footsore travelers to head back to the continent that caused most of their dissatisfaction in the first place? Jot down your thoughts and answer to these questions before reading the discussion. Discussion. The chapter amounts to a critique of value in which the ethical and material standards of the visitors are played off against those of their hosts. Voltaire works this trick from the very beginning, contrasting the perceptions of the boogle-eyed tourists to those of the contented, if slightly, natives. The old man lives in a modest house, the door of which is merely of silver and the paneling in the apartment merely of gold. This sounds like irony, but it is only so in the eyes of the reader and of Candide and Cacambo. To the old man, the house really is modest, the effect of its decor, to which he is quite habituated, one of bare simplicity. Those who live in this earthly paradise are quite unaware of this fact, though they are also conscious of the unseemly and irrational effects that rumors of their land have had on the minds of outsiders. They regard these dreams with muted contempt, because in their country what is priceless to others is so common as to be without value to the inhabitants. The effect from the reader's point of view is to bring into question the whole subject of value. With regard to the second apartment contradiction, Candide and Cacambo are subliminally aware of the unreality of the place they have stumbled upon and are soon anxious to leave it. They head for the smoke and the stress, but there is another, far more cynical reason for their departure. The untold wealth around them is as valueless to them as it is to be to ingenuous people. As long as it remains where it is, if, like the Spanish before them, they can arrange to take it away, the situation would be very different. Then the value system beyond El Dorado will swing back into operation. Candide declares that if they leave El Dorado, we shall be richer than all the kings put together. We shall no longer have inquisitors to fear, and we shall easily rescue Kondagand. According to the narrator, Cacambo was persuaded by Candide's argument, and so they arranged to have some sheep loaded up with gold, and are winched across the mountains to the world beyond. Where does this leave the expectations of those raised on the philosophy of Leibniz, or his discipline Pangloss? The answer is that again subjects such teachings to a thoroughgoing critique, with surprising results. The implication of Candide's and Cacambo's experience of El Dorado is that there are plenty of worlds that are better, they are just not unrealizable. This then is utopia, simultaneously a perfect and a non-existent place. Candide's journey, governed by fate or free will. Voltaire never traveled outside Europe, but Candide was not his first work set in an imagined East, nor was the dervish his first attempt to portray an Eastern philosopher. In 1747 he had published Zadig, or Destiny. Its setting was ancient Babylon, and its protagonist was the philosopher Zadig, who, faced with an inexorable tyranny, such as ancient Babylon was always supposed to have been, ends by developing a questioning attitude to absolute authority and to fate. It is no coincidence that both Zadig and Candide have had subtitles abstract terms that also feature in Voltaire's philosophical dictionary. Dictionaries of all sorts were an important mode of information gathering and discussion during the Enlightenment, a term used to describe an intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, one of whose facets was a strenuous questioning of received religions, religious, social, and political beliefs. In his introduction to Candide, Michael Wood remarks that Voltaire's philosophical dictionary is in effect a companion volume. Activity 8. Read Voltaire's entry on destined fate in his philosophical dictionary and note down its main points. Commenting also on the tone, this entry is reproduced in Appendix 3 of your edition of Candide. Discussion. Obedient to the dictionary convention of beginning with classical precedents, Voltaire opens his entry with a discussion of how Homer understood the meaning of fate. But his tone is far from deferential. Homer, he notes, is often prodigal in his poem with quite contrary ideas, as was permitted in Antiquity. Modern philosophers, he continues, agree that all events are governed by immutable laws, and he proceeds to give several examples of how the strict application of this axiom leads to absurd conclusions, a rhetorical ploy known as reductio ad absurdum. With heavy irony, he then discloses his own view by quoting first unnamed idiots, who say that my doctor saved my aunt from a fatal illness. He made her live 10 years longer. And then one of the other idiots, the Roman satirist Juvenal, who, in Voltaire's translation, argues, fortune is nothing, it is adored in vain. Prudence is the only god to whom we should pray. Voltaire does not stop at the ironic use of the abusive term idiots to reveal his own beliefs. His irony extends to all the authorities he cites in his entry. If there is a pattern, it is that conventionally acclaimed authorities, such as profound statesmen and the philosopher, produce arguments at odds with Voltaire's ideas, whereas the conventionally disregarded opinions of idiots and a peasant give expression to arguments in accord with Voltaire's views. Voltaire concludes the entry by insisting that it is our fate to be subject to prejudices and to passions, and applies this with a playful edge of himself and his readers. We are both equally foolish, equally the playthings of fate. Your nature is to do evil, mine is to love the truth and to publish in spite of you. It is significant that Candide and his band of travelers conclude their journeys in Turkey, a region still dominated by the declining Ottoman Empire, widely and not entirely inaccurately supposed to be despotic. One of the most deeply rooted perceptions present in the 18th century European mind was that a stubborn belief in quiescence before fate or destiny was a characteristic of the peoples of the Orient. In the minds of Voltaire and his contemporaries, such despotic regimes in such places were aided and abetted by the inherent fatalism of the East. The Turkish people, according to this interpretation, were oppressed largely because they believe in fate, and thus held their subjection to be inevitable. The Palestinian critic Edward Said argues in his well-known study Orientalism, 1978, that during the centuries when the culture of the West had predatory designs in the lands of the East, a belief in Oriental passivity and fatalism served as a useful adjunct to these plans of acquisition. Peoples who were temperamentally pessimistic were, it was interfered easily, dominated by their own rulers or by outsiders. In the West, it was supposed men and women were more likely to believe in freedom of choice and were therefore more inclined to resist tyranny. Activity 9. Reread Chapter 30. Conclusion. Paying particular attention to 1. The characterization of the dervish and his philosophy. 2. The characterization of the old man and his philosophy. 3. The ultimate fate of Pangloss and his arguments. What do these final pages tell us about Voltaire's own ideas about free will and fate? Discussion. 1. Voltaire's attitude here seems to me to be one of thoroughgoing relativism. The dervish philosopher is great, but merely in the eyes of his disciples. He is quite detached from the world, and advises Candide and his band to withdraw from the world too. In reply to Pangloss's question, "So, what must we do?" he says, "Keep your mouth shut." The interview concludes with the dervish philosopher slamming the door in Pangloss's face when the latter proposes to discuss the relative merits of freedom and destiny. The old man on the farm also expresses a detached attitude towards the machinations of powerful people in the big city. "I never inquire about what goes on in Constantinople," he declares, "but if both these machinations and his indifference to them are predestined, who are Candide and Pangloss to object?" As a matter of fact, they do not object, but retire to their own garden and do likewise. 3. Pangloss predictably considers everything that has happened to be confirmation of his creed, even though the disappointments he and his companions have endured contradict it. Pangloss's last statement is a triumphant reassertion of his belief system, to which he has remained true through all manner of adversity. But notice that Candide makes no attempt to contradict him. Instead, he remarks that is well said, before going on to express his own hard-won, pragmatic nostrum: "But we must cultivate our garden." In the last chapter of Candide, Voltaire is therefore trying to see the idea of destiny from several points of view. These include not only different schools of philosophy, but also the perspectives on his own common problem adapted by different cultures, Eastern and Western, hence travel writing, and then the philosophical tale come together. The argument travels with the story. Have they then succumbed to Eastern fatalism? Have Candide and his companions found minimal fulfillment at last, or have they simply stopped trying? Something that Voltaire himself never actually did. These are paradoxes that Voltaire, I think, quite deliberately refrains from solving for us. As Voltaire very well knows, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot believe in freedom and fate at the same time. Or can you? In the face of all these bewildering contradictions, Candide's recommendation that he and his friends cultivate their own private patch or garden may seem like a shrug in the face of the difficulties, as well as a gesture of complicity with the attitudes of the old man on the farm. But it is a lot more other than this. We should not ignore the possibility that, at a practical, salutary level, Voltaire was commending gardening as a therapeutic solace. Gardens are pleasant places, and Voltaire was fond of his own. Another world very familiar to Voltaire, which is described in Candide with much less affection, is that of books and publishing. Recall that Candide had taken sympathy on Martin, because he had been a poor scholar who had worked 10 years for the publishing houses of Amsterdam. And there was no occupation in the world which could more disgust a man. This, of course, is one of Voltaire's many end jokes, in this case at the expense of a print trade on the services of which he had been dependent for much of his life. For Voltaire, the candid response, "It seems is to work or sit in your garden, with a book or without one."